Hello class and welcome to chapter 18. Chapter 18 is the last chapter that we'll be going over. It has two parts. This week we'll be talking about the open economy macros, economics, the basic concepts, and then next week we will be talking about the federal debt and deficit. Now get out your study guide and start filling out as we go along. Introduction. So remember back at the very beginning of the semester when we talked about the 10 principles of economics, and the first one of the first ones was trade can make everybody better off. Well, this chapter basically looks at that, and it looks at it in terms of the international macroeconomics behind trade. So trade deficits, trade surpluses, and what trade is, that whole flow of assets between different countries, countries, and what that does to exchange rates. So what is the flow of goods? Well, the flow of goods are two different things. They're called exports. Exports are the goods and services that are produced domestically and sold abroad. So if we produce something in the United States domestically and we sell it somewhere else, it becomes an export. So for instance, if we were to make orange juice in Florida and we were to sell it in Canada, it would be an export. Vice versa, an import is goods and services that are produced abroad and sold domestically. So if the Canadians were to produce maple syrup and they were to sell it to us here in the United States, we would be importing maple syrup from Canada. Now, if we import it, somebody has to export it. And that's where we get into the trade balance. So basically, it's taking the value of the nation's exports, everything we send someplace else. So things like orange juice and soybeans and a bunch of other things, minus the value of everything we bring in. That is your net exports. Some countries have positive net exports, some countries have negative exports. This brings us to the notion of a trade surplus. A trade surplus is when there is a positive net exports. In other words, your exports are greater than your imports. The country sells more goods and services abroad than it buys from other countries. Can anybody think of anybody who might be in one of those situations? Yeah, China might be one of them. The trade deficit is a negative net exports, which means you import more than you export. So when you take your exports and you subtract your imports, you end up with a negative number. So the country sells fewer goods and services abroad than it buys from other countries. The United States is in one of those situations when we look at goods. When we look at goods and services, we get almost to net. The balance of trade is when your exports equal your imports. This has become a very large topic lately. The notion of whether or not it's good to have exports, whether it's good to have imports, whether it's good to have net deficits or surplus or balance of trade. And economists have a lot of different viewpoints on this. The one thing that everybody will agree is that trade makes everyone better off. So back to my orange juice and maple syrup. I like maple syrup on my pancakes. Now, I could get maple syrup from Vermont. Vermont and Wisconsin do provide maple syrup, but not probably enough for the entire United States. So if we all want maple syrup on our pancakes, we are going to need to import from Canada for maple syrup. Now, Canada is a pretty cold climate, comparatively speaking. They don't have the tropics that we have. So things that we can produce in tropical climates, like limes or oranges, they cannot. And I am sure the Canadians like their orange juice, so they probably like to import orange juice from us. We are both better off and our breakfasts are much better. What is a nominal exchange rate? It's the rate at which a person can trade a currency of one country for a currency of another. What am I saying? Well, I'm saying something like this. 80 yen per dollar. That means that every single time we trade a dollar for yen, we get 80 of them. That is a nominal exchange rate. Now, prices can appreciate, which means they strengthen. And what that means is that there's an increase in the value of a currency as measured by the amount of foreign currency it can buy. It can buy more foreign currency. So if the dollar was to appreciate, and the exchange rate used to be 80 yen per dollar, and it becomes 90 yen per dollar, what are we doing? We are getting more yen per dollar. But unfortunately, somebody has to lose. So in this particular case, that means the yen has depreciated. So when you hear the terms, the dollar has appreciated versus the Russian ruble, now you know that means that per dollar, we can buy more rubles than we used to. If it's depreciated versus the ruble, it means that we can buy less rubles. For every currency that appreciates, there's a currency that depreciates. Depreciation means weakening, and it basically decreases the value of the currency. So, whereas an appreciation meant that the dollar bought more yen, a depreciation means the dollar bought less yen. It means that you can buy less of a currency, and it means that the currency has weakened versus the other currency. And this is where it gets confusing, because within our national arena, we trade with many countries. So the dollar can be appreciating against some countries and depreciating against others, all at the same time. Because each of the countries we trade with has a different currency. Now, there are large blocks of currency. Anybody think of a very large block of currency? Yeah, the EU. The EU is a bunch of countries that have one currency. So clearly depreciation and appreciation against a major trading partner like the EU is something that the US government's watching, whereas they're also watching it against Russia, against China, against many of our big trading partners. Now, remember when I was saying that for everything that depreciates, there's an appreciation? So in this case, when we were looking at the dollar, and it went from $1 buying 80 yen to $1 buying 70, when the dollar depreciated, guess who gained? The yen appreciated. The real exchange rate is the rate in which a person can trade goods and services from one country to another. For the goods and services, we're really talking about what? We're talking about the notion of the fact that we are going to look at the price that we pay in the United States for something, or whatever country you're looking at. We're going to look at the foreign price in foreign currency for that same product. And we're going to look at that nominal exchange rate. In other words, the notion of how much foreign currency per dollar, per unit of domestic currency. Yeah, you all looked at me. I could just tell if I was in my classroom, I would have a bunch of rolling eyes. So, if the domestic price for something is $2 and the foreign price is $3 and the foreign price is in rubles, so it's 3 rubles, we need to know what the exchange rate of dollars to rubles are in order to really know what's happening. And why we talk about the real exchange rate is why. What does it matter? The reason why it matters is because this is what affects everyone. It doesn't matter what the exchange rate means overall. What it matters is what happens to products and the price of products, because that's how an economy works. The economy works what? The GDP is the gross domestic product. It's what we're buying and selling. So that's where we're really starting to look. So we're going to take a look at Big Macs. So if in the United States, a Big Mac costs $2.50, and in Japan, it costs 400 yen. All right. And the exchange rate is 120 yen per dollar. So the price in yens of a US Big Mac becomes 120 yen per dollar, E, times the price in the United States, 150. So we can translate the actual price in yen of a US Big Mac to be 300. Now, to compute the real exchange rate, we need to take and look at P, the price per Japanese Big Mac. We already had the $300 because we calculated E times P. And now we're going to divide it by the P with the asterisk, which is what? 400 yen. Now we have an idea of what happens in the relationship and the purchasing power between the two variables. So 0.75 Japanese Big Macs per one US Big Mac. So the Japanese are getting 3/4 of a Big Mac for every US Big Mac. Why do we care? Well, we care because it gives us an idea of where we stand. If the real exchange rate is 0.75, the correct interpretation is to buy a Big Mac in the United States, a Japanese citizen must sacrifice the amount that could purchase 0.75 Big Macs in Japan. So let's take a look at another example. If there's 10 pesos per dollar and the price of a Starbucks latte is $3 in the United States and 24 pesos in Mexico, what is the price of a latte measured in pesos? And what's the real exchange rate? So remember, 10 pesos per dollar. The latte, the tall latte, is costing us $3 in the US, and it costs 24 pesos in Mexico. So what is the price of a US latte in pesos? Well, take the peso per dollar, and then take the dollar bills, $3, and what are you going to get? 30 pesos per US latte. So now you have your relative number. Why is this handy? It's always handy when you're shopping in a foreign country because you can say, okay, well, is that price high or low relative to the US price? I'm used to paying $3. That means I'm used to paying 30 pesos. Now, let's calculate what really happens. We know it's only 24 pesos per Mexican latte. So in theory, as a US customer in Mexico, we're getting a deal, right? Because it costs us 30 pesos in the United States to get that latte, but it's only going to cost us 24 in Mexico. So you get 1.25 Mexican lattes per one US latte. Just what we just figured out, right? We got kind of a deal, didn't we? It's a fun exercise, no doubt about it, but it does give you a notion of how things are traded. And you have to remember that this becomes really important because we are constantly buying inputs into our production cycle from foreign countries, and we're paying for them in foreign currency. But the US currency has to be translated into that foreign currency in order to buy that particular product. And business people are calculating the price in US for the US product versus what it is in whatever country they're going to. And then they're also calculating the real exchange rate. So how do we do this across many goods? Well, instead of taking the price of a latte, we take the price of all of our products, which in the United States is the Consumer Price Index. And then for a foreign level, we take the foreign price level, which of course would be their equivalent of the Consumer Price Index. And we calculate it exactly the same. So what we're doing is we're taking E, the exchange rate, times P, our consumer price index, and we're dividing it by the consumer price index equivalent in a foreign country. The price of the domestic goods relative to the price of the foreign goods is what we're ending up with. If the US real exchange rate appreciates, it means that all US goods are becoming more expensive relative to foreign goods. If the US real exchange rate depreciates, it means that all US goods are becoming less expensive relative to foreign goods. The purchasing power parity is a theory on exchange rates where what they're doing is they're looking at a unit of any currency should be able to buy the same quantity of goods in all the countries. And it's kind of based on this notion that there's a law of one price. And it applies that the exchange rates right now are adjusted to equalize the price of the basket of goods across countries. And why does this price parity matter? Well, let's take a look at our Big Mac example. So let's say the Big Mac contains, the basket in the United States contains a Big Mac. And we know the price of Big Macs, and we know the price of a Big Mac in the US, and we know the price of the Big Mac in Japan, and we know the exchange rate. According to the purchase power parity, really, the exchange rate times P should be equal to the price. So what are we saying? So what we're saying is when you take the exchange rate, yen per dollar, and you take the price in the United States, if the purchase parity was totally correct, then the price in Japan for the yen, for the Big Mac in yen, should be equal to the price in the US times the exchange rate yen per dollar. So if we wanted to solve for the exchange rate, we would say that, okay, the price in Japan for that Big Mac divided by the price in the United States for that Big Mac should equal the exchange rate. So what's the implication of this? The implication of this is that it implies that the nominal exchange rates between countries should equate to the ratios of the price levels. So if countries are having different inflation rates, then E will change over time. And it allows us to start to understand why the ratio of price levels may not equal the exchange rate. And it allows the Federal Reserve or the central bank in any country to start to analyze what is it that's making the difference between what we see as the exchange rate and what we think the exchange rate should be, which should be P in that country, in the other country divided by RP. Why is it different? So if inflation is higher in Mexico than in the US, then P asterisk rises faster than P. So E starts to rise and the dollar appreciates against the peso. And that's where now what has happened? What has happened is that because of inflation, you have a price issue. But if there wasn't inflation, it should be equal to E. If inflation is higher in the United States than Japan, then P is going to rise faster than P in Japan, and the exchange rate will fall, and the dollar will depreciate against the yen. So remember how we were talking about how inflation not only affects the United States economy, but it does have a global effect because it affects the price of our goods relative to the price of other goods? Well, here we go. This is where the purchasing power parity and its implications come into play. So there's obviously some limitations. Two reasons why exchange rates don't always adjust to be equal across the countries. Anybody want to guess? Well, the first one is pretty fun. Many goods can't be easily traded. For example, haircuts, going to the movies. So the prices are different because they can't be arbitraged away. They can't be negotiated away because you can't negotiate a haircut across the border. Foreign domestic goods are not always perfect substitutes. Some people prefer Toyotas over Chevys or vice versa. So you can't necessarily compare people's preferences. This is where marketing comes in. And this is why marketing and economics become so close, because if you think about the power of a brand, it is literally going after the notion of there are no perfect substitutes. So the price difference may actually just be a preference. And this is where supply and demand comes in. Now, it does come in handy in many cases, and it does tend to tell us the price parity, purchase power parity does imply that countries with greater inflation rates, the faster the currency should depreciate. So in a relatively low inflation country like the US, this helps us. And this data does support the prediction. Now, I should go back, but I don't, now that I am in this funny world of whatever. One more thing about the purchase power parity. To remember this is it's important to remember it as a concept. It's important to understand how to calculate. It's important to understand what it means. It's also important to understand it is one of many variables that economists uses to analyze why things are changing between two countries and what may be the causes. Now, remember we talked about this at the very beginning, closed versus open? In all of the analysis we've done to this point, until this chapter, we've always assumed that the economy was somewhat closed. It didn't interact with other economies in the world. An open economy interacts freely with other countries around the world. So what variables affect the net exports and imports of a country? So what do you think would happen if the following was to occur? So what would happen to the US net exports if Canada experienced a recession? We're an open economy. That means that there's falling incomes and rising unemployment. The US decides to be patriotic and buy more US products. The price of goods produced in Mexico rises faster than the price of goods produced in the US. All three are scenarios that can easily occur. And these are with some of our major trading partners. So if Canada experiences a recession, net exports would fall due to the fact that there'd be a fall in Canadian consumers' purchases of US exports. In other words, US exports to Canada, things like oranges and cars and many other things that we export, would decrease because the Canadians would not be able to buy them. So our net exports have to decrease. We export less than we normally do. Thus, even if our imports stayed exactly the same, we would be exporting less. If US consumers decide to be patriotic and buy more US products made in the US, what happens? Well, we would buy less imports. So exports minus imports, the import portion of that equation would become smaller, so our net exports minus imports would increase. Now remember, the net exports is equal to the value of the exports minus the value of the imports. That's your trade balance. So whenever you're kind of thinking about this, I think it's helpful to keep this equation in the back of your mind, because you go, okay, so the Canadians are buying less, so we're going to export less to Canada. If we export less to Canada, that number is going to go down. What does that mean? All right, if we start buying more US, okay, that means we're not going to buy as many imports, so that number is going to go down. It does help to have that equation in front of you. Prices of Mexican goods rise faster than the price of US goods. That would mean that US goods would become much more attractive relative to Mexican goods. So whereas a Mexican product normally might be very popular among consumers, if the price of that good was to rise and we were importing goods into Mexico at a lower price than the Mexican equivalent or substitution, Mexicans would substitute away from their good, their domestically made good, and to the imported US good. So exports to Mexico increase, imports from Mexico decrease, because why would we buy things that are more expensive? So the net exports increase. Keep in mind that equation. It helps a lot. It really does. So what is the values that influence your net export and import? Well, there are a lot of them, and we've looked at a few of them, right? Customers' preferences for foreign versus domestic goods. Sometimes it doesn't matter that the domestic good is cheaper. Somebody prefers the foreign goods. Swiss watches, Louis Vuitton bags, those types of things. Prices of goods at home versus abroad. We just saw that with the Mexican versus the U.S. example, where the prices of good in Mexico went up and the prices in the U.S. were stayed stable, so they imported more goods from the U.S. Incomes. We saw that in the Canadian example, where the income's lowered in Canada. The exchange rate. What if it is such that the foreign currency that's being traded for domestic currency changes? And we looked at that a little bit. Transportation costs. And this happened during, it happens whenever oil goes up. Because remember, when you import something into a country, you have to get it there. So even though the product itself may be cheaper, it may end up costing more by the time you bring it into this country. And government policies. Tariffs and other things such as that may affect net exports and imports, because if a tariff is placed on a price, it may have started out to be cheaper to buy something from someplace else, but after the tariff, it may become more expensive. Or there could be trade restrictions. We talked about it again. I'm going to go through it. So NX, remember in that equation, measures that imbalance in trade. When you have a trade deficit, there's an excess of imports over exports. You have a negative number. If you have a trade surplus, you have an excess of imports over exports over imports. I'm sorry. And if you have a balance, they're equal. The United States tends to have an excess of imports over exports. There are many countries that have an excess of exports over imports. And here is what happens. So as an economy increases their openness, their willingness to trade, you will sometimes see that you will import or export more or less depending on the economy. In the case of the United States, when you look at this particular equation, and it ends somewhere in probably about 2015-ish, you can see that the exports versus the imports are trending about relatively the same, and we're replacing some of the goods that we used to probably produce domestically with ones that we import. And we are exporting quite a few goods, and we are starting to export more, as you can see when you start to look between 2000 and maybe 9 and beyond. Money, capital, flows as well. And capital is what? Foreign assets and domestic assets. They are things that are owned in the United States, or they're things that are owned in foreign countries. The net capital flow, otherwise known as NCO, is domestic residents' purchases of foreign assets minus foreign purchases of domestic assets. So we're looking at what we in the United States purchase abroad in terms of assets, and this would be plants, factories, etc., minus foreigners' purchases of things that happen here in the United States, i.e. hotels, manufacturing plants, etc. NCO is called the net foreign investment, and is looking at the flow of capital. The flow of capital abroad takes two forms. We have direct investments. This is when a domestic resident actively manages a foreign investment. A McDonald's opens a fast food outlet in Moscow. A domestic resident, a U.S. resident, actively manages the fast food restaurant in Moscow. A foreign portfolio investment is when a domestic resident purchases stocks or bonds, supplying loanable funds to a foreign firm. So, if you were to purchase stocks in a foreign company or bonds in Japanese bonds, you'd be supplying loanable funds or funds that would be available to that foreign firm to invest in other things. It's a portfolio investment versus a direct investment. So, here's some review questions. Which of the following statements about a country with a trade deficit is not true? Are the net exports less than the net imports? Is the capital flow less than zero? Could the investments be less than the savings? Could Y be less than C plus I plus G? The one that is not true about a country with a trade deficit is investments are less than savings. The Ford Escape SUV sells for $24,000 in the United States and 720 rubles in Russia. If the purchasing power parity holds true, what is the nominal exchange rate in rubles? Let's do the first one first. Sorry about that. I just realized the slides are slightly out of order. So which of the following statements about the country with the deficit is not true? Remember we said it was investments minus savings, and why is that? Because a deficit means that NX is less than zero. It's a negative number. And since NX is savings minus investments, the trade deficit implies that your investments are greater than your savings, not your investments are less. I should have explained that. Sorry about that. The Ford Escape. So if the purchasing power holds true, what do we learn about the purchasing power? Well, we know that P in rubles is 720,000 rubles. We know that P in dollars is 24. So guess what we can do? We can calculate P in rubles divided by P in US, which is 30 rubles per dollar. All right, that is the class for this week. Hopefully you'll be able to fill out the study guide using this. If you have any questions, of course, as always, contact me. If you have any additional questions about anything happening this week, let me know. Thanks and have a great week.